In 2011, my sister walked toward Lake Moira with a camera around her neck and a silver star on her chain. She told our parents she'd be back before dark. The lake was frozen that week, clear sky, sharp wind, no tracks in the snow. But she never came home. No call, no body, just a red winter boot left near the tree line. 12 years later, I found her voice, and it changed everything. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury, and make sure no name stays forgotten. My name's Ben Callahan. I'm 43 years old, born and raised in northern Minnesota, not far from the Canadian border. My family lived just outside of Clearwater Ridge in a 2-story house tucked between pine woods and frozen lakes. Winters up here lasted 6 months, but we never minded it. You learned to work with the cold, to respect it. My dad was a surveyor with the U.S. Geological Service, spent most of his time charting unmarked terrain and frozen water systems. My mom worked at the local library. Lydia and I grew up thinking that kind of quiet was normal. We had rules, chores, church on Sundays. Nothing fancy, but it was steady, reliable. Lydia was 3 years younger than me. Sharp kid. Obsessed with birds maps, the kind of girl who carried a notebook everywhere just to write things down. We were close even when I left for college and she stayed behind. But when she turned 17, something changed. It started small, a journal she wouldn't let anyone read. Long walks near the lake that stretched past sunset. One night I caught her copying something out of Dad's old topographic files in the garage. She looked startled, almost scared, and shoved the pages under her jacket before I could see. I asked her what she was doing. She just said, "Some places don't stay buried forever." I thought she was just being dramatic. Teenagers go through things. But she kept asking questions about the lake, the runoff basins, old access tunnels from the 80s. Stuff I hadn't thought about since I was a kid. When she vanished that March, we assumed the ice had cracked. That maybe she slipped somewhere remote and the cold took her. Search and rescue swept the lake for a week. Drones, dogs, divers, nothing. The case stayed open but went cold fast. Eventually, people stopped calling it a disappearance. They just said she was gone. I moved away after that. Tried to start over in St. Paul, got married, had a son. I didn't talk about Lydia much. Couldn't. Our parents grew quieter over the years, especially after Dad's health started to fail. He passed last fall. I flew back home to help clean out the house. The garage was packed tight with tools, documents, decades of federal maps sealed in cracked plastic. I was clearing out his workbench when I heard something shift inside the base. I pulled the drawer all the way out, and behind it, tucked in a hollowed-out compartment, was a leather-bound journal. It was Lydia's. Her handwriting, I recognized it right away. Some of the pages were normal, but the last few, they weren't. She'd written about a man near the woods, about a tunnel, and a place near the lake where sound didn't echo, and tucked between the final entries was a hand-drawn map, a red mark, a trail, a door. That's when I called Mateo. He was my best friend growing up, now worked as a forestry tech near Grand Rapids. We hadn't talked in years, but when I told him I found something about Lydia, he didn't hesitate. 2 weeks later, we were both standing on the edge of Lake Moira, boots sunk in old snow, staring at the same water where Lydia was last seen. I didn't come back for closure. I came back for the truth. And that map in my coat pocket, it was about to lead us somewhere we were never supposed to go. Mateo and I didn't speak much as we followed the map around the lake's southern edge. The wind had picked up again, sharp and dry, cutting across the snow like blades. Trees groaned overhead, brittle with ice, and each step crunched beneath our boots in a way that made us both glance back more often than we needed to. The path Lydia had drawn wasn't easy to follow, just a rough sketch lined with faint landmarks and an X near the old maintenance line which hadn't existed on any public map since the 80s. But we matched the ridge line and tree line just the way she'd noted, and after 30 minutes of climbing and circling through brush, We found something neither of us had seen before. It was hidden, well half-sunk, beneath a pine tree that had fallen long ago, its roots curling over a slab of weather-stained concrete. There were no signs, no handles, no lettering. Just a thin red line faded almost to nothing running across the middle, like someone had drawn it there and forgotten why. I crouched and cleared the snow from the ground near the base. That's when I saw the metal plate bolted flat, partly rusted. It looked like part of a hydraulic mechanism, something built to stay sealed. "Old utility," I asked aloud, and Matteo didn't answer right away. He just stepped beside me and stared at it like it had no business being there. I ran my glove along the seam until I found what looked like a recessed handle. I pulled, but it didn't move. Tried again harder this time until I felt something in my shoulder give. Matteo stepped in, and together we forced it open. On the third try, the latch gave. A long metallic groan broke the air, and a cold, musty blast hit us in the face. It smelled like mold and steel and something else, something that hadn't been disturbed in years. Behind the door was a stairwell, tight, steep, built from poured concrete and descending straight down into darkness. A thick cable ran overhead, probably for lighting, but it had been severed in places left to hang. Without hesitation, I stepped inside and clicked on my flashlight. The sound of our boots echoed as we started down each step colder than the last. My breath clouded in the beam, and somewhere deep below water dripped at a slow, steady pace. I kept Lydia's journal close to my chest, flipping to the last page as we reached the bottom. She had written about a tunnel, said it led to a room she wasn't supposed to find, called it the place with no echo. The hallway was long and narrow with a low ceiling and rusting pipes that ran along both sides. Most of the doors we passed were sealed tight. They had labels stenciled beside them, C1 Storage, D3 Archives, E2 Mess Hall, but none of them looked touched in years. Except one. Just past the intersection, a door marked Liaison Room 3, Restricted, stood slightly different than the others. The handle had newer scuffs around it, and on the floor in front the dust had been disturbed. Someone had dragged something heavy through recently. I crouched beside it and ran my fingers along the edge, felt a faint groove like a cartwheel had rolled over it. "This is it," I said quietly. She wrote about this room. The door was rusted shut at first, but with enough pressure it cracked loose. Inside was a square chamber, 12 by 12 maybe, with walls lined in thick acoustic foam, the kind used in recording studios or testing cells. The moment we stepped inside, all sound vanished. Our steps made no echo. Even breathing felt muted. "This is what she meant," I whispered, and the words barely carried. At the center was a metal table, and on it a reel-to-reel recorder. Dusty, unplugged, but intact. Along the far wall, shelves lined with labeled tapes. Some dated all the way back to the late 80s. Most were tagged with government markings, DOE property, internal use only. Others just had years scribbled on them. Then I saw it. A reel marked 2011 LC Private in red ink. I took it in both hands just to steady myself. Lydia's initials. I knew them anywhere. Matteo didn't say a word, just nodded when I looked over. The recorder still had a backup battery installed. I threaded the reel and hit play. Static at first, then a pause, then her voice. "If anyone finds this, it means I was right, and that I didn't make it out. I didn't breathe, just listened. I came down here after I saw him again. The man near the ridge, I don't think he knows I saw him, but I heard him, talking on a radio, about a door, about containment." She sounded scared, but measured. "I'm making this recording because I don't trust the people I spoke to in town. Someone's covering something up. I think it has to do with what used to happen in these tunnels. I found blueprints. This place wasn't decommissioned. Not really. I still hear machines at night." Then more static, and her last words. "If I don't come back, don't believe the story they tell you. Please keep looking." The tape spun to silence. I stood there for a long time, not moving. Mateo stepped back toward the doorway, glanced down the hall. She was here, he said low. She wasn't just imagining things. I nodded slowly. And someone's been keeping it buried. We left the soundproof room without speaking, but the silence followed us. Every step down that corridor after felt heavier. The air was colder. The lights above us flickered once and then again. I noticed another door, this one marked Records Personnel. It wasn't locked. Inside, we found a desk, a wall of filing cabinets, and a faint scent of old paper and mildew. I opened one drawer at random, nothing but empty folders. But then I found a personnel form. Yellowed, crinkled. A black and white photo clipped to the top. Charles D. Renair, Facility Oversight Supervisor. Clearance Level 5. On the back of the page, a handwritten note. CR still using access port near maintenance dock. No radio logs. All systems offline during entry. I showed it to Mateo. This has to be the guy she saw, I said. He didn't argue. 12 years later, he'd be in his 50s, he said. You think he still comes down here? Before I could answer, we both heard it. Metal on metal. Distant, but close enough. A door, maybe. Or something heavier. We froze. Turned off our lights. Through the slit beneath the records room door, a shadow passed. Slow, deliberate. We didn't move. Didn't even shift our weight. The figure paused, then walked on. After a full minute, Mateo leaned close. That wasn't just building noise. No, I whispered. We're not alone down here. I held the page tight in my jacket and reached for Lydia's journal again. The next location she marked was labeled with one word storage. And whatever had just walked past us, it hadn't come to fix the lights. It had come to make sure no one ever found what Lydia left behind. We waited in the dark for a long time after the footsteps faded. Neither of us said anything. The only sound was the low hum of old air pushing through the vents and the soft tick of water dripping somewhere behind the walls. When we finally stepped back into the corridor, I kept one hand on Lydia's notebook and the other on the edge of the wall, careful with every step. The air had changed, felt heavier now, like the place knew we didn't belong there. We stayed low, moving past the last of the labeled doors until we reached the next mark on her map. It was a steel door set into a concrete arch with a half-worn sign above it. Main storage, Level 2, access. I pushed against the handle and it opened easier than I expected. The hinges gave a long, slow creak that echoed faintly behind us. Mateo swept his flashlight across the space and for the first time we saw how deep it went. The room stretched wide, 2 stories tall, with rows of stacked crates reaching nearly to the ceiling. Dust floated through the beam of light, but it wasn't the kind of dust that settled over decades. It was unsettled, moving like someone had been through here recently. We stepped further in. Toward the center, a folding table had been set up modern out of place with an old camping stove, 2 water bottles, and a torn wrapper from a protein bar dated just last month. Mateo picked it up and turned it over in his hand. Not from the 80s, he muttered. I nodded. Whoever's been staying down here, it wasn't that long ago. In the corner, half covered by a tarp, we found a cabinet. The front lock had already been broken. Inside, old files were stacked in crumbling manila folders. I reached for one near the top. It was still intact. The label read Incident Reports. Internal Interference. 1996-2005. I opened it slowly. One of the pages was handwritten, barely legible through water stains and red pencil notations. But one entry caught my eye. Dated March 18, 2011. Unauthorized Subject F. Teenage female observed entering Corridor C3 without clearance. Surveillance malfunction logged. No action recorded. Subject not recovered. My hands went cold. Mateo, I said, turning the page toward him. They saw her. They logged it. And they didn't stop her. He read it twice, then stepped back like the paper had weight to it. They let her go in, he said. They knew. Before I could respond, a sound came from the hallway. Heavier this time. Not distant, close, measured, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. We moved fast, grabbing as many of the reports as we could, and slipping through a side door at the back of the room. It led into another corridor, narrower, darker, unfinished. I pressed my ear to the steel door behind us, just as the footsteps reached the main chamber. A voice followed, calm, male, speaking low just above a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but then came the soft crackle of a radio. A click, then silence. But it wasn't empty. I knew the sound. It was someone checking in, reporting, tracking. We stayed quiet, crouched behind the door until the steps retreated. Mateo looked at me. That was no squatter. I didn't answer. We moved again, following the corridor deeper until we reached a dead end, a wall of rusted supply barrels stacked in front of what looked like another sealed entryway. I pulled them aside one by one until I found the door Lydia had marked. It was older than the others, with a sign barely visible under the corrosion water access. Decommissioned, 1992. Mateo kicked it open. The hinges gave, and we stepped into another sloped tunnel, low damp, lined with moss in places where the light barely reached. It took 5 minutes to reach the next chamber, circular, domed, a drainage grate at the center. And there against the wall, faded green fabric, sun-bleached and weather-worn, was a backpack. I moved toward it already knowing. It was hers. Same one I'd seen a dozen times at the kitchen table, covered in bird patches and safety pins. I unzipped it slowly. Inside were a few things: a disposable camera, a flashlight, a folded topographic map marked in red, and a journal. Her journal. Pages bent and smudged, but still legible. I flipped through it and found the same handwriting. Same voice, but more frantic now. There's someone else down here. He knows I saw the door. He has a key. Not a key like a normal one. A code. He said something about Port B. I turned the page and found the last thing she'd written. I'm leaving this here in case I don't come back. If Ben finds this, I hope he never stops. I closed the book, hands tight. We weren't going back. Before I could say anything, the tunnel behind us filled with static. A voice, amplified and distant, cut through the air like a warning. We know you're still inside. Step out with your hands visible. No one has to get hurt. Mateo looked at me. We're being hunted. I grabbed her backpack and zipped it shut. Mateo moved to the far end of the chamber where a secondary tunnel forked away. A narrow crawl space beneath the old drainage line. This way, he said. It's tight, but it goes. The radio crackled again, this time sharper. You are in possession of restricted materials. Stop where you are. We didn't answer. We moved. The crawl space was just wide enough to squeeze through on hands and knees. Pipes hung low overhead and runoff water dripped in thin lines along the wall. We didn't speak, just pushed forward until we reached another room, smaller, more industrial. Pipes ran in bundles along the ceiling. At the far end, a heavy hatch embedded in the wall. Mateo found the access panel. Scratched into the surface, barely visible beneath grime, were 4 digits, 3791. I reached for Lydia's journal and flipped to the map. She had written the same numbers in the corner, almost too small to notice. I punched them in. The lock clicked. The hatch opened to a clean hallway. Bright, dustless, painted off-white with fresh LED strips humming overhead. Mateo stopped beside me. This isn't abandoned. We moved fast, passing doors labeled Archive Room 1 Catalog Storage Internal Records. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar. Inside was a tidy office. A powered-on desktop sat idle screen glowing softly. No password prompt. No user login. I sat down and tapped the keyboard. A file directory opened immediately. Personnel logs, daily briefings, internal memos. I typed the name, Renner. 1 entry. Charles D. Renner, Facility Oversight, active until 2013. Dozens of documents filled the screen, some marked confidential, others flagged for internal review. I clicked on the only one with no metadata. It opened to a scanned surveillance, still Lydia, standing near the tunnel entrance. Date stamp, March 17, 2011. Below the photo, a note. Subject observed entering Port B alone. Flagged for passive monitoring. File moved to internal review. No further action taken. I didn't move. I just stared. They watched her. They let her go in. And they never came for her. Then from the ceiling a speaker crackled. A distorted voicemail filtered through compression. Step away from the desk. This is your final warning. I didn't respond. Just pulled the USB stick from the terminal and slipped it into my jacket. Mateo leaned close. They're watching us live. And if they were watching now, tracking every step, then the only way out was forward. We didn't speak as we left the office. The air felt tighter now, and every footstep carried more weight than the one before. I kept my hand on the USB in my coat pocket, feeling the shape of it through the fabric as if somehow it could anchor me. What we'd seen on that terminal. Lydia's photo, the note about passive monitoring, the decision to take no action, none of it was surprising anymore. But it still knocked the air out of me. It meant someone saw her go in, watched her walk through those tunnels, and then let the door close behind her. We moved fast, retracing our steps down the corridor until we reached the hatch we'd come through. Mateo tried the handle first, but it didn't budge. He shoved it again harder this time, but all it did was rattle. I looked past him toward the floor. Small red lights blinked along the seams of the door. The whole thing had sealed itself. Probably triggered the second we accessed the system. He turned to me. We're locked in. I didn't answer. Just started scanning the walls for anything we missed. There was another door behind a row of filing cabinets, unmarked and narrow. I pulled it open and we slipped through. The lighting changed instantly dimmer with exposed wiring and no clean finish. This part of the facility wasn't polished like the last. It felt raw, like something the contractors had started and then abandoned halfway through. The air was heavier here too, almost humid. We walked in silence, passing broken utility carts and rusted-out machinery. Somewhere nearby, a ventilation fan clicked rhythmically, the blades slow and uneven. We kept moving, following the slope of the hallway downward. After a few turns, the corridor widened into what looked like a maintenance level. Old junction panels lined the wall, most of them labeled with handwritten tags, barely readable. There was a wall-mounted map near the end, faded and stained, but one word still stood out clear: intake. Mateo stood beside me and pointed to the left side of the layout. This section here, it loops beneath the lake. I followed the map with my finger, tracking an access route that broke away from the main halls and circled something marked simply as observation. I didn't say anything, just folded the map back into my coat and kept walking. The hallway opened into another chamber, this one lined with old medical gurneys and overturned chairs. Along the walls, metal cabinets, most marked with stencils, bio-monitoring intake files classified. I opened the first drawer and found photos. Black and white, time-stamped. Some were surveillance stills. Others looked like they were taken in the moment, faces lit by fluorescence. Some calm, some not. A few of them had been circled in red marker. Others were crossed out. I kept flipping. Then I saw her. Lydia. Hair-wet eyes wide, standing in what looked like one of the tunnel corridors. The photo wasn't like the one from the terminal. This one was different. She wasn't just caught on camera, she was being watched, monitored. A small paper note was clipped to the corner of the photo. Subject LC, unresponsive to isolation protocol, displayed irregular access pattern, escaped observation. Mateo stepped closer, looked over my shoulder, then said almost under his breath, "She didn't get lost down here. They held her. And she got away. I didn't respond, just tucked the photo into my jacket and kept moving. At the far end of the room, we passed a locked equipment cage and another map. This one showed a hatch labeled Port B with a narrow route leading back to the upper access tunnels. I memorized it as best I could. Then we heard the sound again, the soft whir of a motorized cart coming from somewhere back in the corridor. It wasn't fast, but it was deliberate. I didn't wait. We ran. The hallway twisted once, then bent around a sloped incline that dropped toward the lower sublevel. At the end, Mateo found the ladder first buried beneath a rusted grate. He threw it open and I followed him up into the boathouse. The air changed instantly. It smelled like wood rot and motor oil, but it was outside air. Cold, sharp, and real. I turned and dragged an old filing cabinet in front of the hatch as Mateo caught his breath against the wall. We were clear. For the moment. The trees outside were washed in pale orange light. Sun setting fast, shadows already stretching across the lake like reaching arms. We didn't waste time. We moved through the woods fast and low, following the fire road behind the tree line. I didn't check the map. Didn't need to. I remembered every turn from the hikes we took as kids. We didn't stop until we reached the old ranger station. The windows were boarded, the door unlocked. Inside it smelled like dust and wet pine. The radio console was still there in the corner. I swept the maps and debris off the table and powered it on. The screen flickered. Static. Mateo flipped through the frequencies. Emergency bands, shortwave local AM. Nothing. Then on channel 3 a burst of garbled audio. Search perimeter widened. All units stand by. He looked at me. They're still out there. That was when we heard footsteps on the porch. Not rushed. Careful. A hand on the door handle. I reached down and grabbed the first thing I could find, a rusted wrench. But when the door creaked open, it wasn't who we expected. It was a woman. Late 60s, maybe sharp eyes, gray hiking coat. Her hands were raised. "Ben Callahan," she asked calmly. "I'm Ela Rohr." I didn't lower the wrench right away. She reached slowly into her coat and pulled out a faded ID badge. "Department of Environmental Analysis." I stared at her. "You worked with my dad." She nodded. "More than that. I knew your sister. She came to me 6 months before she disappeared. She had questions about the lake, about the land, and about a facility your father never mentioned." Mateo stepped closer. "Why are you here now?" She looked at him, then back at me. "Because Lydia told me if anything ever happened to her, I was supposed to find you." I didn't move, didn't speak. Elaine stepped fully inside and closed the door behind her. After she vanished, someone came to my house. No badge, no name, just said to leave it alone. And I did. For too long. She looked down at the floor, then back at me. "But I think you've seen enough to know this wasn't an accident. And it's not over." I reached into my coat and pulled out the USB. "We have files, logs, photos, even a recording of Lydia's voice." I paused. "They're still watching this place, still guarding it." Elaine nodded. "Then it's time we stop reacting. There's a second way in. Older, not on any current maps. I found it once before it was sealed. You'll need it if you want to finish this." Outside, the wind shifted again. Sharp hollow carrying that low hum that never really left the lake. I didn't ask what came next. I already knew. Elaine spread the topographic map out on the ranger station's table, smoothing it flat with both hands. Her fingers hovered over a shaded rise southeast of the lake near a runoff basin most people wouldn't even recognize as man-made. "Here," she said quietly. "There's an access hatch about 2 miles in. You'll miss it unless you're standing right on top of it. Built before the main expansion in '88. Last time I saw it, it wasn't locked, just sealed by age and weight. I studied the lines she'd marked. then looked at Lydia's notebook again. On the last map Lydia drew near the lower edge, there was a small red arrow that didn't make sense to me until now. She hadn't labeled it. No explanation. Just a faint curve tucked into the corner like it wasn't part of the trail. I never gave it much thought before. But looking at Elaine's map beside it, I realized they lined up. The shape, the angle, even the scale. Lydia had known. She had found that hatch. She hadn't just wandered the tunnels. She'd mapped the outer rim of something bigger, and she'd left that mark behind, not to finish the story, but to point someone else toward the next part. I folded both maps carefully and slipped them into my coat. Elaine looked over at me. We move at first light. We left before the sun had cleared the trees. Frost clung to the pine needles and coated the ground like glass. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that swallows sound before it carries. Mateo led the way for the first mile, following a deer trail through dense underbrush until the land began to slope. The terrain got rockier as we climbed. Roots twisted underfoot and made every step feel uncertain. After an hour, Elaine stopped beneath a stand of spruce trees and pointed to a shallow depression beneath the moss. "It's under here." We cleared away the layer of leaves and old pine needles until the metal edge revealed itself. The hatch was flush, with the ground built low into a concrete collar. Rust had fused the seams, but the lock was still intact, simple mechanical, not electronic. Just old. Together, the three of us pried it open with a steel bar Mateo carried in his pack. It took both of them holding it wide while I climbed in first. The ladder was intact but slick. The air below was damp and still, and it smelled like cold stone. I flicked on my flashlight and started down. The shaft dropped about 20 feet before opening into a low corridor lined with cracked tile. Water had seeped through the ceiling in places, running in thin streams down the walls. It wasn't as sterile as the upper compound. No numbered panels or labeled rooms, just raw space, concrete mildew and silence. Elaine came down last, pulling the hatch closed behind her. "This wing was built as part of the old water treatment grid," she said, "but they never integrated it into the main access path. Only people who knew it existed would come this way." We moved slowly. The corridor narrowed, then widened again as we passed through what looked like an old storage section. Most of the crates had collapsed under their own weight. A few still held labels, but the ink had faded to smears. We didn't stop to open them. Everything here felt like it had been left in a hurry. At the far end, the corridor opened into a junction point with 2 doors. One of them was marked with stenciled lettering, Maintenance Sub B, Restricted. The other had no label at all. The restricted door had power. A faint red light blinked just above the frame. Motion sensor. Mateo noticed it first. "Still live," he said, stepping back. Elaine nodded. "They're logging entries from here. We can't trigger it." She found a panel nearby, half buried behind a rusted shelving unit. We cut the power at the base and the red light went dark. I opened the door slowly. What we found inside didn't match the rest of the wing. The room was dry, intact, even clean. Metal shelves lined the walls and a humming server tower blinked in the corner. This space hadn't been forgotten. It had been maintained. Mateo moved toward the cabinet marked with a label I couldn't look away from. Callahan L. 2011-2012. Inside a thick folder sat upright edges still sharp. Next to it, sealed in a transparent evidence bag, was Lydia's necklace. Silver chain, star-shaped charm. The one she wore on the day she left. I hadn't seen it in over a decade. I picked it up without thinking. It was light, still cold, and completely out of place in a room like this. Elaine opened the folder. Inside wasn't a missing person report. It was a behavioral file. Dozens of pages, time-stamped entries, observations, dietary notes, environmental exposure logs. It read like a patient record from a long-term care facility, but stripped of any human context. One entry stood out. April 3rd, 2011. Subject LC attempted contact with surface via unauthorized terminal. Contained and reassigned. No disciplinary protocol initiated per CR. I looked at the margin. CR. Renner. Another line a few pages later, April 16th. LC removed from intake level. Final transfer to holding C initiated. I didn't need to ask where that was. Elaine closed the folder and said it anyway. Holding C is a deep isolation wing. No windows, no record keeping. It was supposed to be shut down in '94. Mateo stepped over to the server tower. If anything survived from that wing, it's here. I handed him the USB. He connected it and began copying the contents. One folder stood out unlabeled but dated April 2011. Inside was an audio file. I didn't recognize it at first. Then I heard her voice. Faint, barely above a whisper. April 18th. I've been here 3 days. No one speaks. Lights never turn off. I hear water behind the walls. I think they're watching me, but I haven't seen them. I don't know what they want. Then silence. Then her name. If someone ever hears this, my name is Lydia Callahan. I came here on my own, but I didn't stay willingly. Please, tell my family. I tried. I stood still for a long time after the recording ended. I didn't speak, didn't move. It was her, not just her voice, her fear, her logic, her clarity. She had recorded that moment because she knew no one was coming. Mateo disconnected the USB and slid it into his jacket. "We've got it," he said. "Everything we need. Let's get out before they realize we cut the feed." We stepped back into the corridor. The lights overhead hummed faintly, and somewhere down the hall the silence broke with movement. Soft footsteps. Not hurried, but steady. More than one. Elaine pulled us back behind a pipe junction. The footsteps passed. Close. Someone spoke into a radio. Archives accessed. No visual on intruders. Tracking heat signatures. Confirming movement toward North Tunnel. Mateo's voice was low. "They're using thermal." I looked at Elaine. She nodded once and pointed across the hall. "That panel. It's vent access. Not wide, but it drops into the old drainage grid. They won't have visibility there." We didn't wait. I pushed open the panel and dropped into the vent. Metal walls, narrow crawl space, cold air pushed through from below. I heard them behind us. Searching, but not rushing. Just close. We kept moving forward, elbows scraping breath short. We didn't know what we'd find at the bottom, but we knew what we were leaving behind. A room full of files. Lydia's voice now saved. A necklace that should have never left her. And a truth no one had wanted found. The vent shaft narrowed after 20 feet, the metal walls closing in tighter with every elbow pull. It was dark, humid, and the only light came from the faint green of Elaine's headlamp behind me. I could feel my shirt sticking to my back, the air so still it felt like we were crawling through something that hadn't moved in years. Beneath us, I could hear the muffled echoes of boots, search teams, sweeping the tunnels. They weren't rushing. They were confident. That was worse somehow. They didn't expect us to find a way out. The shaft veered left and started to drop. I gripped the edge and slid feet first into a vertical pipe that smelled like rust and algae. My boots hit cold concrete a second later. I stepped aside to let the others through. We had landed in some kind of overflow chamber, stone walls, drainage grates, and a single steel hatch that looked like it hadn't been opened in a decade. Elaine moved, first wiping the moisture off a faded stenciled plaque near the hatch. Holding C. "This is it." Her voice sounded different down there, like the air swallowed it before it could carry. She turned the wheel lock slowly. It groaned but didn't fight. The door opened into a hallway that was darker than the shaft behind us. No windows, no emergency lighting, just damp stone and the faintest buzz of electrical current. I stepped in first. The smell hit me immediately like mold and antiseptic and something else. Decay, maybe, or time. The corridor led to a junction that split into 3. The walls were covered in old clipboards and empty mounting brackets. One still had a torn checklist pinned to it dated 1995. Nothing was checked off. I swept my flashlight across the ceiling and saw the security camera dead maybe, but still angled at the junction like it remembered what it was watching. We moved left. The hallway curved slightly and narrowed until we reached a sealed observation room. A broken desk sat in the middle, covered in empty water bottles and a stack of old manila folders. Most of them were blank, but the last one had a photo paper-clipped to the front, a woman in her 30s, eyes swollen, staring straight ahead. Underneath the file said, Subject R003. Notes dated 2 years after Lydia disappeared. Elaine flipped through it slowly. "This isn't Lydia," she said. "But this place didn't shut down in '94. Not really." I took the file and slipped it into my pack. We kept going. At the end of the hallway was a grated metal door. Mateo tested the latch. It was rusted, but it gave with some effort. Behind it, a staircase spiraled down into blackness. The walls were soaked. There was no handrail, just the sound of dripping water echoing in the dark. We descended in silence, counting the turns. 4, then 5. By the 6th, we hit bottom. The floor was covered in shallow water that came up past our boots. Ahead was a massive steel door, unmarked, sealed with a locking bar that looked welded in place. I scanned the wall until I found the switch. It took both Mateo and me to force it down. The lock disengaged with a deep clang that echoed up the staircase. The door opened into a chamber unlike any we'd seen. It was wide, circular, and quiet. The walls were lined with steel booths, 6 in total, each with a small bench, a drainage pipe, and no windows. Solitary cells, the kind used in black sites, not facilities on U.S. soil. Each door had a number and a lockbox. Elaine moved methodically, checking each one. Booths 1 through 4 were empty. Booth 5 had a pile of fabric in the corner, a shirt, torn at the collar. On the back, faded by time, were the letters LC. I stepped inside. The air was colder than the rest of the chamber. I knelt down and picked up the shirt. The tag was still intact. Lydia's size, her brand. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Elaine opened the final booth, number 6, and stepped back quickly. The walls were covered in marks, scratches, tally lines, hundreds of them etched into the metal with something sharp. They went floor to ceiling. At the top of the wall, barely visible under a layer of grime, were the words, "I remember who I am." Mateo's flashlight caught on something near the drain, another evidence tag. Numbered and faded. It had once been attached to a small spiral notebook, now half destroyed by water damage. The cover was gone. Most of the pages had fused together. But one line was still readable in the middle of the stack. "Don't believe what they say. They took me. My name is Lydia Callahan." Elaine took it from my hand and held it like something living. Her eyes didn't leave the page. "They kept her here," she said. "Not for days. For months. Maybe longer." I moved toward the far wall, tracing my hand along the cold steel until I found the edge of another door. This one wasn't labeled at all. Just a seam in the wall that led to a narrow hall lined with server racks and monitoring gear. The screens were dark, power long gone, but one of the units had a backup drive still pulsing faintly. I plugged in our USB. Mateo ran the extraction again. He didn't speak as he worked. I stood at the far end of the room staring at the wall of monitors and wondering what they had shown when they were live. The people who sat here, who watched, who recorded all of them saw her, and none of them stopped it. A minute later, Mateo pulled the USB and nodded. "We have it. Everything from holding C logs, photos, audio, names. We turned to leave. But then I heard something. Not footsteps, not voices, just a shift, a faint creak from somewhere above us. Elaine froze. They found the stairwell. I didn't wait. We moved fast, retracing our steps back through the booths into the hall past the first grate. Back up the spiraling stairs, 2 at a time. Water splashing behind us. Someone else was coming down. No lights, no sound, just boots. I turned at the 4th landing and caught the outline, tall figure, no flashlight, descending steady. We reached the access door and slammed it shut behind us. Mateo jammed the locking pin. We ran the rest of the way to the junction and turned toward the utility shaft. It took all 3 of us to lift the grate. Once inside, we moved without speaking. Through the shaft, into the woods, back toward the ranger station. By the time we reached it, dawn was just breaking. The tree line was washed in pale blue. The cold air had settled. I dropped the evidence bag, the USB, and the torn notebook onto the table, and then for the first time we sat in silence. Not from fear, not even shock, just the weight of it. The final piece had fallen into place. Lydia didn't just disappear. She was taken, held, watched, documented, and someone, maybe more than one, had signed off on every second of it. We didn't sleep that night. None of us said it out loud, but I think we knew once we'd stepped into Holding C there was no going back to pretending. Elaine kept the files spread across the ranger station's table, sorting them by hand, cross-referencing timestamps, initials, entries, scribbled side notes. Mateo worked from the laptop, combing through audio logs and stripped surveillance clips we pulled from the server bank. I sat with Lydia's necklace in my hand, watching the light catch the tiny silver star, remembering how she used to spin it between her fingers when she was nervous. Around 3 a.m., Elaine stopped suddenly. She pointed to a printed memo buried between 2 other reports. It was dated June 2011, 2 months after Lydia was transferred underground. The header was what got me. It didn't come from the usual admin staff or the facility's medical board. It came from a private consulting firm based in Utah. The name on the memo was stamped Renner Strategic Behavioral. Underneath that, a signature, handwritten. C. Renner. I read it twice. My throat went dry. Caleb Renner, the same man who'd signed off on Lydia's original intake form. The same name from her therapy log. The one person we were told had never been formally involved in her post-disappearance care. And here it was, black and white, 2 months after she vanished, giving explicit authorization for her transfer to long-term behavioral study environment under controlled observational parameters. No criminal charge, no court order, no family notification, just a signature and a directive. Mateo opened a personnel file from the same folder. Renner's credentials were impressive PhD military clearance private sector behavioral research, but the last 5 years of his file were redacted, entire pages replaced with black lines. At the bottom of the last page, an internal note. Contract suspended pending review. Outcome non-disclosed. Elaine looked over at me. He didn't just know about Holding C. He was running it. The next morning, we left early and drove straight to the records office in Canyon County. Elaine had a contact there, retired investigator now overseeing archiving. He let us in under the condition that we didn't make trouble. We didn't say much. Just asked for access to old decommissioning orders related to Pine Bridge Regional Mental Health and its adjoining properties. He nodded once and pointed us to the back vault. What we found confirmed what we already suspected: the facility wasn't legally decommissioned. It was reclassified. Around 1994, ownership shifted to a nonprofit under Renner's umbrella. They filed a charter under the name Civic Response Foundation, claiming the site was being repurposed for crisis response training. The blueprint amendments included underground space usage labeled as emergency containment drills. No one inspected the space again after that. It was sealed from public access, protected by private funding, and monitored off-grid for nearly 20 years. Back at the station, Mateo loaded the final batch of recovered audio into the console. One clip stood out from the others. It didn't match the usual log formats. It was longer, degraded, and sounded like it had been pulled from a live surveillance feed, not a patient recording. At first, it was just static and low echo muffled footsteps, maybe a voice. Then I heard Lydia's name, spoken softly like someone reading it off a chart. Then the same voice said, "Subject exhibited signs of adaptive resistance. Requesting reorientation schedule per CR." A pause. Then a second voice. This one cold, measured, negative. Subject to remain isolated. Observation sufficient. No further conditioning required. I didn't recognize the voice at first. But when Elaine pulled an old conference clip from the Civic Response Archive audio from a public speech Renner gave back in 2003, it matched. Perfectly. The inflection, the rhythm, the way he said words like subject and sufficient. It was him. Mateo leaned back in his chair. He was still active, still pulling strings even after she was moved down. Elaine added quietly, and someone higher up approved it. We pieced the rest together slowly. Lydia had shown signs of emotional distress after her second intake interview. She'd asked to leave, demanded even. But once she was labeled as unstable and detached from any guardian contact, there was no one to advocate for her. No legal flag was ever raised. And by the time she disappeared from the public record, Renner had shifted her case from mental health to behavioral research, just enough of a change in designation to fall through every oversight crack. We weren't just looking at a single disappearance. We were looking at a system built to erase accountability, to house people without scrutiny, all under the label of care. That night, Elaine did something none of us had dared yet. She called the county sheriff's office, not the local deputy, the actual sheriff. And she didn't use vague terms. She used names, places, specific file numbers. And when she told them she had 3 eyewitnesses, 1 former facility contractor, and a chain of physical evidence leading to an active illegal holding site, there was silence. Then a single question. "Do you still have the audio?" She said yes. The call ended with a quiet directive. "Don't leave the station. We're coming to you." 2 hours later, 2 unmarked vehicles pulled up to the ranger station. Federal plates, unofficial badges. The man who stepped out wasn't in uniform, but his voice carried weight. He asked for everything. The files, the drive, even the notebook from booth 6. Mateo asked for a warrant. The man paused. "We're not here to arrest you," he said. "We're here because you finally found the part they buried." I gave him the necklace last. He looked at it for a long time before folding it into a cloth pouch and slipping it into his coat. Then he nodded once. "We'll need to verify everything he said, but if this checks out, it won't stay buried." He didn't say goodbye, just walked out into the cold and drove off. For the first time since this began, I felt the silence settle in a different way. Not empty, just waiting, like something was finally shifting even if we couldn't see it yet. Elaine closed her notebook, looked out the window, and said almost to herself, "They always thought no one would come looking, but they were wrong." They came back 3 days later, this time with real credentials. Department of Justice, 2 agents from the Civil Rights Division, and a state investigator from Minnesota who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. They moved quickly, but with care, scanning every document, tagging every drive. Elaine sat with them most of the day, explaining how the files had been recovered, how the power system still hummed underground, how Booth 6 wasn't just a chamber, it was a holding cell. She showed them Lydia's name across multiple logs, intake records, audio transcripts, internal memos bearing the signature of a man whose public biography ended in 2009. The agents didn't ask many questions at first. They just listened, wrote things down, took photographs. It was only later, after they'd packed up the evidence into 5 gray crates, that one of them, Agent Farley, pulled me aside. She looked at me and said, There are 2 other names in those logs that shouldn't be there. You're not the only one who's been looking." The next call came from Canyon County Medical. They'd pulled archived imaging from an old training study tied to the Civic Response Foundation, the same nonprofit Rainier had used as a legal front. Among the files was a batch of scanned intake photos dated 2012. Low resolution, some corrupted. But one of them, when enhanced, showed a young woman seated against a bare wall, shoulders slumped, a blanket over her lap. She wasn't looking at the camera, but I recognized her. The curve of her jaw, the tilt of her nose. It was Lydia, still alive. At least a year after they said she was gone. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not relief exactly, but a shift. The kind of weight that changes how you breathe. Mateo stood behind me, just staring at the image. Then he pointed to something in the corner of the photo. A tag. Metal. Fixed to the wall behind her. The label read H6. West. Booth 6 hadn't been the only one. The next morning, the DOJ launched a quiet investigation into the Civic Response Foundation and its satellite facilities. I use the word quiet because none of it made the news. No press releases, no statements. But over the course of a week, at least 2 rural properties were raided under sealed warrants. Elaine tracked most of it through back-channel contacts calls that ended fast doors that were suddenly locked. One facility deep in Utah had already been cleared out. Another in Idaho still had active monitoring equipment. The agents found unprocessed footage, notes referencing subject trials going back to 1998. There were names, some redacted, some not. One was Lydia's. Another was a boy from Wyoming who'd gone missing in 2005. His case had been listed as runaway. Another was a girl from Wisconsin, age 15. I didn't recognize her name, but her intake photo showed the same cold walls, same worn blanket, same blank expression, and when we looked closer, same silver star necklace. That's when everything shifted. The DOJ made contact with 2 families whose children had vanished years ago. They didn't know about Holding C. They'd been told their kids were either dead or never found. When shown the recovered materials, one mother collapsed. Another couldn't speak. The case turned from isolated misconduct into a federal civil rights probe. The sheriff's department launched a parallel inquiry. So did the state licensing board. Rainier was named officially as a person of significant interest. His last known residence in Boise had been sold in 2017. His financial record scrubbed his research credentials suspended years earlier. But he wasn't gone. According to a flagged transaction buried in the Civic Foundation's expense reports, a monthly stipend had been wired to a private P.O. box in southern Arizona under the name CR Holdings. The address linked to a mailbox near an unregistered modular facility. Surveillance picked up a man in his 60s entering the building just days before the account was frozen. The man hasn't been seen since, but that wasn't the end. In a locked cabinet beneath one of the West booths, agents recovered a secondary log, handwritten, not digital. Different ink, older paper, carefully kept. Inside were transcripts of therapy sessions, not generic ones, specific. And among them, a name I hadn't heard in years, Dr. Alden Rusk. He'd retired in 2008. Used to work at a different clinic near the border. Specialized in adolescent trauma. He was the man who treated Lydia after she was found the first time when she showed up barefoot outside of Pine Bridge after being gone for 9 days. No one ever told us what she said in those sessions. We were told she barely spoke. But now, sitting in front of me, were quotes in her own voice. She talked about a metal room. No clocks. Men who didn't speak. And once scrawled in the margin by Rusk himself. Patient believes she was brought there before. Before what? Before the 9-day disappearance? Or before she even remembered being taken? Elaine looked at the notes for a long time. They didn't just bury her, she said quietly. They looped her. I asked what she meant. She pointed to a phrase repeated in 3 separate entries. Reorientation complete. Elaine explained that some experimental behavioral programs used repetition to break identity patterns. They'd disorient subjects, isolate them, then feed controlled memories through repetition until their sense of time fractured. In some cases, the patient would believe the event had happened only once. In others, they'd forget it happened at all. Lydia had remembered just enough to reach out, just enough to draw a map. But the truth, it had been done before, maybe more than once. The last photo came through that evening. A still from the Idaho site taken after the raid. One of the investigators standing at the edge of a corridor. Behind him, painted on the wall in faded red letters, were the words, "No one believes you." It wasn't a threat. It was a system, a structure built on silence. And for over a decade it had worked. Until now. We sat in the station until the lights went out. Mateo made coffee, though none of us drank it. Elaine opened the logbook and wrote a single line, confirmed. We weren't wrong. I called my mother just before midnight. I didn't tell her everything, just said we'd found something, that we were closer. She didn't say much, but before she hung up she said, "Tell her I still wear the star." That night I pulled the spare cot beside the desk and lay there staring at the ceiling. Somewhere in some part of the country the man who started this was still alive, and somewhere in that darkness he still believed no one was coming. But we were. We found Lydia 6 weeks later. Not in a facility, not in a room, but in a shelter near the Nevada border under a different name using papers that didn't match speaking barely at all. One of the volunteers recognized her photo from a quiet bulletin the DOJ had circulated. They called us before they called anyone else. Mateo and I drove through the night. When we got there, she was sitting on a bench outside, wrapped in an old hoodie, watching the wind push dust across the parking lot. She didn't run. She didn't speak at first either. Just looked at me. I sat beside her, careful not to crowd, and said, "You don't have to come back, but you're not alone." Her eyes didn't change, but she nodded once, slowly. That was all. They didn't press charges against her. There was nothing to press. She'd been a victim since she was a child, manipulated, erased, looped through that place until memory itself couldn't be trusted. The investigation continued, though. The DOJ confirmed that at least 5 facilities had operated under the Civic Response Foundation's web of shell charities and closed research grants. 3 were decommissioned. 2 had been abandoned long enough to become nests for coyotes and dust. But the logs told the story. Names, dates, times, what had been done, and who had been inside. One of the agents, a younger guy from Oregon, told me quietly that in all his years, he'd never seen so many records hidden so deep yet maintained so meticulously. It wasn't chaos. It had been designed to disappear. Elaine testified before a closed committee. Mateo submitted the files under seal. I sat through every hearing I could, but most of it happened behind doors I wasn't allowed to open. Still, the work mattered. Some families got answers. Some names were corrected in databases that had once written them off as runaways or lost causes. And Lydia, she stayed with us for a while. Not at my home, she didn't want that. But nearby. Quiet apartment, simple routine. She saw a specialist. Drew. A lot. Pages and pages of what looked like static until one day it started to look like the inside of booth 6. Then a corridor. Then a face. And then she stopped. Said she didn't want to draw anymore. And we didn't ask her to. My mother sent her a new necklace. Same silver star, same weight, same length. Lydia held it for a long time before putting it on. This time she said, "I'll keep it." We didn't press. We just listened. That's what most of this became, really. Listening. To the survivors. To the parents. to the kids who'd grown up with holes in their stories they couldn't explain. It doesn't fix anything, but it holds something together that might have slipped away. As for Renaer, he was never found. The last verified sighting was near an airstrip that serviced private medical charters. One agent said the manifests showed an outgoing flight with a single passenger to an unlisted clinic in South America. But by the time they traced it, the trail was cold. There are still redacted files, still names we haven't unlocked. But we know what he did, and now the people he silenced, people like Lydia, are not forgotten. I still keep the logbook in my office drawer. The one Elaine started. It's heavier now, full of timestamps, initials, clipped photos. There's a note on the inside cover. Just one line. Truth matters even when no one looks. That's what this was always about. Not headlines, not vengeance, just making sure that what happened couldn't be erased again, that someone remembered, that someone named it. If you've listened this far, thank you. Stories like this don't move fast, they don't fit neatly into 15 minutes, but they carry weight. And if this one stayed with you, consider sharing it, so no name gets left behind.